Since we've previously covered this idea that we're in this transitional stage towards Caesarism, it's important, I think, to discuss it a little bit more, perhaps in depth, on the particulars of what Caesarism is, particularly according to Oswald Spengler, but then also, I think, primarily for us, understanding, is Trump a Caesar, and what form, morphological form will he or a Caesar in the West take? So to begin with, I think it's important to understand why Spengler has this term Caesarism. It's not that necessarily Rome was the only empire to go through the life cycle and have this momentary or 200-year moment of great men of fact ruling in their own way. It happened in China, it happened in ancient Egypt, and it happened in the Middle East during the Magian period. Every kind of recorded civilization has this time when great men and sometimes women often make themselves known, and in that sense become a Caesar of their civilization of the and what would be for us the Faustian civilization. So it's important, I think, to at least verbatim understand what Spengler means, and that's why there's a lot of excerpts here which exactly detail his thoughts on this. So what I'll do is just read them out, and then we can discuss a little bit about the concept of a Caesar, and then what that form that will take in the Faustian morphological present. And so just starting with his formation here of Caesarism is a victory of force politics over money, increasing primitiveness of political forms, inward decline of nations into a formless population, and constitution thereof as an imperium of gradually increasing crudity and of despotism. What I would say we will start to understand is that these political aberrances of what you might say NATO was just a product of this freak occurrence that was unlikely to happen again, and that the different formations around America as the nucleus of this political nexus, which we can call Western Europe, is at hand. And so we can now start to understand why America and American exceptionalism starts to gather so much importance. It's in this way that we can start to see that even Rome had fractal and parochial leanings in different provinces, but as a totality, Rome was ruled in Rome. So the idea that the West will be ruled in America is a fairly likely, I'd say, scenario. And at this point, there's going to be a lessening of the political distance between Germany and France and the UK and Canada towards America, such that you might still have nominal regional rulers, but once again very prosaic and parochial in their ability to implement any meaningful international strategy. So our Caesar is almost by force a American Caesar. And then understanding this, we want to also look at a bit of what Spengler says around the form of a Caesar. And here he goes on to say, as the English kingship became in the 19th century, so parliaments will become in the 20th, a solemn and empty pageantry. As then sceptre and crown, so now people's rights are paraded for the multitude, and all the more punctiliously the less they really signify. It was for this reason that the cautious Augustus never let pass an opportunity of emphasizing old and venerated customs of Roman freedom. But the power is migrating even today, and correspondingly, elections are degenerating for us into the farce that they were in Rome. Money organizes the process in the interest of those who possess it, and election affairs become a preconcerted game that is staged as popular self-determination. If election was originally revolution in legitimate forms, it has exhausted those forms, and what takes place in this mankind elects its destiny again by the primitive methods of bloody violence when the politics of money become intolerable. Hopefully that's fairly clear, and is to say it's extremely relevant in terms of what we can see for both party politics and in general across the West. And for America to sort of continually engage, or you might say, in what would be, well, Spengler terms pageantry, but this farcical sentimentalism where we have all these traditions of how you go and be elected at party conferences, and that there's this notion of an electoral college giving votes to people, and that we still have an idea that my vote counts in a lot of ways when it just plainly doesn't, and that you're better off moving if you wanted your vote to count to specific tiny counties in swing states for it to actually be a momentous purpose. And even then you'll still have an unlikely attribution to choosing the next president. And the president here now, after what have been legal precedents is set in the Supreme Court, can now do whatever he wants because it's legal, in the sense that the president is a legal entity above the courts. So Nixon obviously being redeemed here somewhat in his idea that he was allowed to do whatever he wanted in terms of spying, in terms of interdiction, all that sort of stuff. So here I think we are just continuing on this path of Caesarism, and that if it is to say that Trump won't be the next Caesar or the first Caesar, akin to say Sulla, he'll at least be the presage to the real Caesars, in that he'll have what we recognize as most of the forms of what a Faustian Caesar will take. I'll read this next excerpt from Spengler's work, and just to give you a bit more context. Caesar derived his power from the tribunate, in his dignity and therewith his permanency from his being the princeps. Here too the soul of old Gothic wakens anew. The spirit of the knightly orders overpowers plunderous Vikingism. The mighty ones of the future may possess the earth as their private property, for the great political form of the culture is irremediably in ruin. But it matters not, for, formless and limitless as their power may be, it has a task, and this task is the unwearying care for this world as it is, which is the very opposite of the interestedness of the money power age, and demands high honour and conscientiousness. But for this very reason there now sets in the final battle between democracy and Caesarism, between the leading forces of dictatorial money economics and the purely political will to order of the Caesars. And in order to understand this final battle between economics and politics, in which the latter conquers its realm, we must now turn our glance. Now, after reading that, I think hopefully it's something maybe that interests you enough, or you've read it before, or there's some tangible message that really speaks to you around how the transformation, and this is form going to form, morphologically speaking, of a money-dominated politics, whereby in America you can purchase votes, in the UK you can purchase votes, in basically all of Western Europe there's a function of money to be turned into force politics, rather than necessarily having this blood politics which is spoken directly to the soul from the Caesar himself, and then takes the form of the Caesar. There's no notion of money except as a kind of byproduct or a function of the Caesar. So it becomes from a preeminence to a second or tertiary function around why we're interested in following who is basically going to be leading our civilization. This kind of brings us to an identification of the previous, or Roman Caesars, and what forms they took. And I think for me it was quite interesting to read a little bit, well, obviously I've read quite a lot about Roman Empire, but diving a little bit deeper into Sulla, and with an interesting anecdote here around Sulla's ability to use military force against his own countrymen was, in many ways, a continuation of the social war. A civil war between former allies and friends developed into a civil war between citizens. What was eroded in the process was the fundamental distinction between Romans and foreign enemies. I think potentially with the existing tensions in the UK, but also the heightening tension, and tension in the very real and palpable sense for the Americans around, they call themselves conservatives and Democrats or liberals, or I think these functions break down entirely when it really becomes the Carl Schmitt enemy and friend distinction, and we will choose a side in a way that no longer holds true to any paradigm that previously had been fixed in our minds. So these archaic and anachronistic almost party politics become obsolete in the face of this transformational blood politics, which is why it's so important to know about it. The way that Caesars in Rome obviously were related very directly to the army, and most of the early ones at least were generals and involved in military command. I think in America there's still this notion of service, and that many politicians do enlist and have served. Whether this takes any form from the post-Trump era, because obviously Trump was not in the army, although he did attend, I think, a military college when he was younger, which is to say that in Western Europe, it's unlikely that many of the politicians have actually served. So there is a huge contradistinction between an American, who would be Caesar, having much more military aligned, both from a oratorical point of view, having to speak much more to the military as an important function and silo in the country, versus also having to speak how that army internationally functions as the world police, more or less. And so there's always going to be this, not debt, but necessarily leverage that the army has over an American president, because it is the arm of power which he will need to wield in the sense he wants to make sure that his situation and position is secured, which is very different from other Western politics, which is much less focused around army and has the spending of a military budget very low in the priority list of their manifesto, with notional agreements towards buying 50 tanks this year or 3 submarines this year or whatever it might be, rather than general war preparedness, which is an American facet mostly. Cutting back, to the Roman side of things, where we say the Gracchi brothers, and there was quite a long period from say 150 BC to 100 BC where the populace and the body of people and the masses were very unhappy, and that there was a lot of tension around economic opportunities, but also the rights and the understanding, I think, from the plebs that they got, which was, you're not important in the layer of ruling and the direction of the country. And so I think there was a lot of purposelessness, and you can see that from a lot of the same issues we face today in our societies around societal collapse indicators, whether they be economically or total fertility rates, or they could be around the mental health, the rise in mental health cases, and the budgetary spend on social programs in general just going up and up and up, because obviously there's an unsatisfied populace which has to be satiated in some way, and usually that is monetarily at this point, but also services. I think when we consider Caesars, and like I did say, that there are other cultures which have had Caesars, and so in China, Spengler identifies the contending states period, and where the Chinese contending states go from 7 of disparate and contending needs down to just 1, and that the abolishment of the states comes through, and in very Chinese fashion, acts of grand war with many lives lost. So the way that the Caesars take form and then rule will be different between civilizations. So we won't say we'll have a Julius Caesar, which the media is very keen on alluding to with Trump, or some other political equivalent, say Crassus, or he had a large property portfolio, and even if it's someone more like Sulla, probably. In any case, I think Spengler identifies the 3 main, or like the 3 embodying early Caesars, as Sulla, Julius, and then Tiberius, and how they interact and exemplify what being a Caesar means, because of the way that they were themselves the form that the ruling state took. They became de facto the government, regardless of the Senate and its ability to influence politics. There was obviously a lot of personal risk to a Caesar, and that the importance of a bodyguard and all these sort of things becomes heightened when you have these periods of risk around one head of state being the totality of rule at that point in time. With what we might say is a contravention of the existing paradigms, but this is our paradigm, right? So our rules and our systems, they just no longer matter in the same sense. So superficially, we may continue to have a constitution, we may continue to have a Bill of Rights, we may continue to have a parliament, but because the purpose of all of these institutions loses its actual significance, it's just left with the shell, because we've sucked out all the important things and given them, imputed them straight into what would be a Caesar. And even in the UK politics, I think you can see this with the lack of importance of a party and a platform and a manifesto, in contrast to just having a leader who the party follows, and that leader will then dictate what the party policy will end up being. Going into an election, you more or less do know what that will be, but at the same time, it is a funny reflection on the dictatorial level of a party leader that has kind of become through the last 150 years in UK politics. I don't think that many Americans would consider Ronald Reagan, for instance, very Caesar-like, even though he still embodies some of these attributes of not being of being a person of the people and all this sort of stuff. And he won very heavily during his election times. He also got dementia at the end, so that maybe has something to do with how there was no, what you say, legacy from Reagan. But in any case, I think then we could probably take a look at Trump, because given that is the context, hopefully that's helpful in understanding why Caesarism is important and how Trump relates to Caesarism in his own way. To provide, I guess, the proem on this is to say that Spengler greatly admired Cecil Rhodes and how his function in terms of being a businessman related directly to his statesman abilities, and that he was of the opinion that Rhodes would be this new kind of Faustian Caesar type. Rhodes being just very much a prototype of this, is to say that the form of Faustian Caesar will be something similar to what Rhodes did and who he was. So there was very much a foreshadowing around this, and I think there's been much debate and speculation around what Rhodes' legacy is, but in a general sense, I think that's how we should start to understand it. There is a quote here where I think it should give a bit of guidance around the mindset of a Caesar. It's to say, Caesar saw things as they were and was guided in the exercise of his rulership by definite and unsentimental practical considerations. This speaks to Spengler's idea of the man of fact, which is what he calls someone who understands reality, and politics to him is the possibility. So you are political when you understand the possibilities, and a man of fact is a man, and particularly in the form of a Caesar, a man who just does and acts and has not this consideration profile around his decisions and wondering whether he will be making good, bad, moral decisions. He just does as instinct, and because that's his, you might say, his physiognomy around his spirit taking form. And once you're in form, there is no need to reflect and have necessarily all these opinions and advisors and help, even though they will be surrounding you in the center of power. It's this centrifugal notion that there's always a nexus with a nucleus in the middle, and all these nodes feeding out onwards and outwards, and in terms of how close you are to the power is obviously your importance. So which is to say that the form of the government will no longer matter. So it doesn't matter if there's a Congress and a Senate and this three where they have the Supreme Court and having these three separate but overwatching principles where none can rise above the other. In any leadership and organizational structure, the leader will always take precedence. There's no functioning ability for any social organism to go forward or backwards without this. So that's how you can kind of think about why the president will always be the Caesar first. It won't be the leader of the Supreme Court being Caesar. It won't be the leader of the Senate, Speaker of the House. It won't be these people. It will always be the president. He is always going to be the one. I think it's maybe an aside, but it's to mention why America and why the president is the same question you can ask. It's why does 500 million native speakers make the rest of the 8 billion speak the same language, suffer the same culture, suffer the same media, be forced to understand history from our perspective, our morality. I mean, you have to understand just the nature of the power here, that America and around the Anglo sphere has contributed so much to the globe in terms of its knowledge and its existence, that we use American dollars internationally for, say, oil and gas. We speak English, and if not as your primary language, your secondary language, and almost always people wanting to migrate to English-speaking countries. You have a huge amount of economical interests residing in Anglo countries, probably predominating the world economy by a large factor. And if you expand that, as I say in most of my presentations, to a pan-Germanic understanding of Western Europe and the Faustian culture, then you're talking almost the totality of the global economic output, barring, say, China and Japan. The rest being mostly just resources and otherwise outsourced functions of the American and Anglosphere Western European economies. Like, if your economy is derived basically as a call center or a service center, or like some outsourced function of our businesses, then you're really just being incorporated by an American business in your own country, which speaks a lot more to the sovereignty and the lack of sovereignty you might have, particularly if your country is also a base for an American outpost, or a division or a regiment. The union of these Germanic nations, you might call it, is basically a default assumption at this point. It will be this tying together of and homogenization of all these semi-related or very related cultures, but in a way that's semi-political, and by necessity will have a conjoined force component. So there will be one union of an army, there'll be one union of economically, and there'll be one union probably of things like free travel and visas and even maybe citizenships, things like that. It's not going to be one world government, but it will very much be the Occident in its totality. The understanding of Caesar's rise here, and Trump in particular, is very intuitive actually, and we can see this in the fervor and the fanaticism of his opposition. So people who hate Trump have such zealous, as I say, fanaticism against stopping him, that one of them was prepared to shoot him in the head. I'm sure there's very many others who are plotting other things around Trump and his health and safety, because they're so desirous for an outcome where he doesn't win. And the Democratic Party has no notion of, or has no ability to beat him. Like, their means of defeating a Caesar with what they have is impotent. They really need a Caesar of their own, but their misunderstanding of what it takes is emblematic in the way that they are only negative, so it's only attacking Trump and trying to defend against Trump, rather than to propose their own version of a Caesar and get behind someone like that, which once again is very instinctual, and we can see that it is rational. So you never have to deal with Democrats irrationally. You don't have to think, oh wow, I can't believe they're not in touch with reality. It's just that their version of the reality is one born out of just fear, and that you can maybe attribute rationality to the fear component of that, but just to say, like, they're reacting as you would when you are in a case of panic. So when we can comprehend that and attribute it to Trump, I think that gives him one of these ticks in terms of, do we think he is the next Caesar? The other interesting, before I get to the quotes here on the page and finish up with talk around the last gasp of pork barreling and money politics, but is to say that Trump's rise can be directly correlated, or maybe it's conjoined with the fact legacy media has lost its stranglehold on the ability to form opinions, public opinions. So the sway that they have had historically has been around me not understanding that the events are happening internationally, so having to buy a newspaper and read about them, or having to see on TV a certain editorial message around what has been happening. And then it applies obviously domestically around crime and around any form of domestic disturbances, or then when it comes to election times, very much politically on here's my platform, here's how you should think. And obviously each executive and CEO of a media company is going to try and sway, but with their biases and what they want outcome wise, working in tandem with the political parties to be able to more or less buy votes or buy opinions. And so knowing that they can no longer control the narrative, you see a huge amount of chaos seep into this void where platforms like Facebook become a war zone of opinions, and that if you see a video on Facebook showing you something as it happens, you're now in the space of creating your own opinion and thoughts, or as maybe with a video of mine, you see it first and you go, oh, that's his presentation of these facts, let me just have a Google. But now you've been, I wouldn't say, I don't want to say I'm a propaganda machine, but you've been informed by my own thoughts and my own opinions in a way that my truth on these subjects is now residing in the back part of your brain, couched in your other thoughts. So it potentially taints how you perceive things. This, I think, is super powerful, and it's exactly why Trump knows social media in a way that allows him to be as popular as he is, and why his opponents like Kamala Harris or the Democratic Party don't understand it, and they are trying to connect it in ways that an advertiser or someone trying to sell you something would, which is not how Trump acts. Trump doesn't care, and that's why people like him. A Caesar would not care about what the plebs thought. He would say how he would go and do things, and the plebs would like him because his idea of uplifting all is a natural element of who he is. Trump is a very nice guy. If you find him distasteful for several things, that's completely fair. But in general, he's got a good heart, and you know from his actions what type of person he is. And that's why people will gravitate towards him, which is obviously very Caesar-like. He's written a book. Caesars were obviously very big into writing and reading, and so you can maybe see the distinction there, where he's also someone of a spiritual businessman, and that his Viking instincts are quite strong, and that he wants to still allow himself to be the voice of both business and politics, in the unity of that is definitely very Caesar-like in the Faustian sense of new Viking politics. And our transition into the knightly realm will obviously take place over the next 50, 100 years, so you'll see a transformation there as well. Lastly, I'll just read out these kind of three really important excerpts, and then you'll be done. And then I'll speak about pork barreling. But before them, the money collapses. The imperial age, in every culture alike, signifies the end of the politics of mind and money. The powers of the blood, unbroken bodily forces, resume their ancient lordship. Race springs forth, pure and irresistible. The strongest win, and the residue is their spoil. They seize the management of the world, and the realm of books and problems petrifies or vanishes from memory. From now on, new destinies in the style of the pre-culture time are possible afresh, and visible to the consciousness without cloaks of causality. There is no inward difference more between the lives of Septimus Severus and Gallienus and those of Alaric and Odoacer. So here it's Spengler at least envisioning a world where, because mind and money predominated so heavily in the 20th century in particular, where we had so many ideas and fantasies around world peace, the UN, and how we could just pay for everyone to be uplifted and all their problems would be solved. We could give aid to every country in the world. We could open free trade agreements with every country in the world, and somehow that this economic miracle and all this money would be solving these problems, whereas we know factually that America is better off than it ever has been, and people are still unhappy, they're still disgruntled. There is this element that they're not satisfied, and that can't be solved with money, and it can't be solved with the mind. It has to be done through the blood actions of a Caesar, and then there'll obviously be turmoil around that, because there'll be large percentages of the population which disagree, as there always is an enemy and a friend. For world peace, which has often existed in fact, involves the private renunciation of war on the part of the immense majority, but along with this it involves an unavowed readiness to submit to being the booty of others who do not renounce it. It begins with the state-destroying wish for universal reconciliation, and it ends in nobody's moving a finger so long as misfortune only touches his neighbour. Already under Marcus Aurelius, each city and each land patch was thinking of itself, and the activities of the ruler were his and his own. And with this, it is fairly evident, I think, even on a more micro scale, when you look at the riots in the UK, which maybe is outdated when you watch this video, but where communities clash so heavily that it's not necessarily now that you identify yourself from I'm English, but it's more like I identify myself in the sense that I'm from this certain suburb of a city like Hull, and then even from this, the inability for action for some people who will be affected. And there's this very cheesy almost saying of like, they came for the Poles and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a Pole, and they came for the Jews and I said nothing because I wasn't a Jew, and then they came for me and there was no one left to save me. But it is this mentality around protecting what is yours first, a misunderstanding that the function of this destruction will inevitably sweep you up as well. And then lastly, I think it's just around and this is very repetitive, I know, but the Viking instinct here. So on this spiritual premise, a second Vikingism develops. The state of being in form passes from nations to bands and retinues of adventurers, self-styled Caesars, seceding generals, barbarian kings, and whatnot, in whose eyes the population becomes, in the end, merely a part of the landscape. We almost see what is a return to serfdom, and in this we understand power as the mechanism by which we can own both the polity, so that the body of the nation or whatever region that you've conquered, but then also the land itself. So it's tied instinctively one to one almost again, which is a reversion back to feudalism almost, but definitely serfdom, where you would then understand that unless you're willing to be on the side of what will be the victor, so the Vikings obviously when they win take the spoils home, or they do what they will because they're enabled by having no threat to themselves after conquering, their ability to do what they will and what they want to do. Yes, and then I think just to sign off here, you can see Trump obviously encapsulated perfectly here as what would be his epitaph, or his maybe his statue after he dies in Washington DC, that'll be desecrated over and over again by several generations of other Caesar followers. But it's to say that in this you can see his Caesar spirit rise up, and that I think regardless of your feelings towards him, you can recognize the glint of greatness, and whether we can see that in the next 5 years or whether it'll just be a presage to the next 50 and 150, then time will tell. But I think in this stage it's fairly likely that he is this first edition of what we can consider a Caesar.